If you keep wondering why your tomato plants look healthy but still give you only a few small fruits, while someone else is already filling baskets with large red tomatoes, then I can tell you that the biggest mistake usually happens long before the first flowers appear. I made that same mistake myself for years, and every summer I blamed the weather, the seeds, or bad luck. The truth was much simpler, and once I understood it, everything began to change. I am not talking about expensive fertilizers or complicated tricks because I have never liked spending money when a simple habit can give a much better result. Over the years, I learned that tomatoes reward patience more than effort, and they notice every little thing we do, even when we think it does not matter. That is why today I want to share the 10 steps that helped me harvest tomatoes earlier than my neighbors and with much less stress. I am not saying my way is the only way, but I can honestly say it has worked for me season after season. Many people rush to plant tomatoes as soon as they feel the first warm days. I used to do exactly that because I was afraid of losing time. Then one cold night would arrive and my plants would stop growing for weeks. They stayed alive, but they never truly recovered, and I always wondered why the harvest was so late. An older gardener smiled when he saw my disappointment and told me something I never forgot. He said that tomatoes do not care about the calendar. They care about the warmth hiding inside the soil. That simple sentence changed the way I looked at the whole season. Since then, I stopped watching only the air temperature and started paying attention to the ground itself. Most people never think about this small detail, and that is why they lose valuable weeks without even realizing it. The first step is not planting early. The first step is planting at the right moment, and there is a very easy way to know when that moment has truly arrived. Once you understand this one habit, the next step becomes much more effective, and that is where many surprisingly large harvests really begin. When I finally understood that the soil decides when tomatoes are ready to grow, I stopped rushing and started preparing the planting place with much more care. This is the second step, and in my opinion it saves more time than almost anything else during the whole season. Many people dig a hole, put the plant inside, cover it with soil, and believe the job is finished. I used to do the same thing, and then I wondered why the plants looked tired after only a week. An older neighbor watched me one spring and quietly said that tomatoes need a good home before they can think about giving you a good harvest. Those words stayed with me because they turned out to be true. A few days before planting, I loosen the soil well and remove old roots and weeds because they only compete with young plants for moisture and food. Then I mix in well-rotted compost because it costs almost nothing if you make it yourself, and it gives the soil a soft and rich structure. I never try to force fast growth with too much fertilizer because I learned that large green leaves do not always mean more tomatoes. Most people make that mistake and later wonder why they have beautiful bushes but very few fruits. Another small habit that many people ignore is watering the planting hole before the seedling goes into the ground. I do not pour water on top after planting and hope it reaches the roots. I give the roots moisture first so they immediately feel comfortable in their new place. It is a simple, old method that was shown to me many years ago, and I still use it every season. I also plant my tomatoes a little deeper than many beginners expect because new roots can develop along the buried stem, and that gives the plant more strength during the hot weeks of summer. You do not need expensive products for this, and you do not need special equipment. Just a little patience and careful preparation. Most people hurry through this part because they are excited to finish planting, but I have learned that an extra 10 minutes now can save many days of disappointment later. The next step may seem even less important at first glance, but I can honestly say it has probably protected more of my tomatoes than any fertilizer I've ever bought, and very few gardeners give it the attention it deserves. The third step taught me that watering is not about giving tomatoes as much water as possible. It is about giving them the right amount at the right time. I know many people who proudly water their plants every evening because they believe they are helping them. I smiled when I heard that because I used to do exactly the same thing. My plants always looked fresh after watering, but later the fruits would crack or stay smaller than I expected. For a long time, I could not understand why. Then, an experienced gardener who had been growing tomatoes for decades told me something very simple. He said, "Tomatoes like consistency much more than generosity." That sentence stayed with me because it explained years of disappointment in just a few words. Now I water deeply, but not too often. I let the moisture move down where the roots are instead of keeping everything wet only on the surface. This encourages the roots to grow deeper and stronger, and when the hot summer days arrive, the plants suffer much less. Another mistake that most people make is watering the leaves instead of the soil. It seems harmless, but wet leaves can create problems that are much easier to prevent than to fix later. That is why I always try to water close to the base of the plant, and I prefer doing it early in the morning. The soil has time to absorb the moisture, and the plants begin the day with everything they need. Years ago, an elderly neighbor showed me another forgotten method that costs almost nothing. After watering, he covered the soil around the plants with a layer of dry grass or clean straw. At first I thought it looked too simple to make any difference, but after trying it myself I noticed the soil stayed moist much longer, and I spent far less time carrying watering cans across the garden. It also helped reduce weeds, which meant the tomatoes no longer had to compete for water and nutrients. Little by little the plants became stronger and the fruits started growing larger than I had seen before. Most people overlook this easy habit because it does not look impressive, but sometimes the oldest methods survive for a reason. The next step is one that many gardeners are afraid to do because it feels like they are hurting the plant. I felt exactly the same way until I saw with my own eyes how much difference it made by the middle of the season. The fourth step was probably the hardest for me to accept because it felt completely wrong the first time I tried it. I looked at a healthy tomato plant full of fresh green shoots and I simply could not understand why anyone would remove them. It seemed like I was making the plant weaker instead of stronger. Then, an old friend who had been growing tomatoes for longer than I had been gardening smiled and told me to trust the plant instead of my eyes. He explained that not every new shoot helps the harvest. Some only take away the strength that should be going into the fruit. That was difficult for me to believe until I saw the results with my own eyes. Since then, I inspect my tomato plants every few days and gently remove the small side shoots while they are still easy to pinch off with my fingers. I never wait until they become thick, because then the plant loses more energy and the wound is larger. Most people either remove nothing or remove too much. Both mistakes can reduce the harvest. I learned that slow and regular attention is much better than trying to fix everything at once. Another habit that helped me was tying the plants to strong supports before they became heavy with fruit. Many gardeners wait until the stems begin to bend and then struggle to keep everything upright. I used to do that every year and often broke branches by accident. Now I place the support early and guide the plant little by little as it grows. It takes only a few minutes, but later the stems stay straighter, the fruits receive more sunlight, and the air moves freely around the plant. That simple airflow is something many people forget about, yet it can make a surprising difference throughout the season. There is another old method that almost disappeared, but I still follow it every summer. I remove only a few of the lowest leaves once the first fruit clusters begin to develop. I never strip the plant bare because the leaves are still feeding it, but clearing the lower part helps keep the stems cleaner after watering and gives the plant a healthier appearance. None of these small jobs cost any money and none of them require special tools. They simply require paying attention every few days instead of waiting until problems become obvious. The next step is the one that convinced even my skeptical neighbor because after I started using it, my tomatoes not only ripened earlier, but they also became noticeably larger and more flavorful than before. The fifth step is the one that changed the size of my tomatoes more than anything else I had tried before, and the interesting part is that it does not require expensive products or complicated equipment. For years, I believed that feeding tomato plants meant giving them as much fertilizer as possible. Every time the leaves became lighter, I reached for another bag from the garden store because I thought more nutrition had to mean more tomatoes. What I actually got were huge green plants that looked impressive from a distance but produced fewer fruits than I expected. It took one conversation with an elderly gardener to make me realize my mistake. He smiled and said that a tomato plant should not spend all its strength growing leaves when it should be filling the fruit. From that day, I became much more careful with feeding. I always begin with good soil and compost because they provide a steady supply of nutrients without pushing the plant too hard. Later in the season, I feed only when the plants truly need it, and I never believe that adding more will automatically improve the harvest. Most people make that mistake because they want quick results, but tomatoes usually reward balance instead of excess. Another simple habit I follow is checking the plants every few days instead of waiting until something looks seriously wrong. I look at the leaves, the flowers, and the tiny fruits because they often tell you what the plant needs before any real problem appears. This takes only a few minutes, but it saves a great deal of disappointment later. There's also an old method that many people have forgotten. After the first clusters of tomatoes begin to grow, I gently shake the flowering branches on a calm morning. An experienced gardener showed me this many years ago and explained that it helps the flowers release pollen more easily, especially during still weather. It sounds almost too simple to matter, but after trying it for several seasons, I noticed that more flowers turned into healthy tomatoes. That small habit costs nothing and can be repeated again and again during the flowering period. By this point in the season, the plants are stronger, the roots are deeper, and the first fruits are already promising a good harvest. Still, there is one more step that many gardeners ignore, and in my experience it often decides whether those tomatoes become truly large and sweet or remain only average by the end of summer. The sixth step is something I never paid much attention to when I was younger, because I thought once the tomatoes started growing, the hard work was already finished. That was another mistake that cost me many good fruits. I used to leave every tomato on the plant no matter how many there were because I believed more fruits always meant a bigger harvest. It sounded logical, but the result was often disappointing. The tomatoes stayed smaller than they should have been, and many of them took much longer to ripen. Then an old gardener who had been growing tomatoes almost his entire life showed me something that at first seemed strange. He said, a plant has only so much strength, and if you ask it to feed too many fruits at once, none of them will reach their full potential. Since then, I have watched my plants much more carefully. If I see damaged fruits or very small ones that clearly will never develop properly, I remove them without hesitation. It may feel difficult the first time, but after a few weeks, the remaining tomatoes begin to grow faster and become much larger. Most people are afraid to do this because they think they are losing part of the harvest. In reality, they are helping the plant put its energy where it matters most. Another habit that has helped me for many years is harvesting tomatoes as soon as they begin to change color, instead of waiting until they become fully red on the vine. Many people are surprised when I tell them this, but tomatoes continue ripening very well indoors. By picking them a little earlier, I reduce the weight on the branches and encourage the plant to keep producing new flowers and new fruits. It also lowers the chance of losing beautiful tomatoes to heavy rain cracking or unexpected pests. There is one more forgotten method that I still use every season. Toward the end of summer, when I know the weather will soon begin to cool, I remove the very top growing point of each plant. An experienced neighbor taught me this many years ago and explained that the plant then stops wasting energy on new growth and focuses on ripening the tomatoes it already has. It is a simple job that takes only a few minutes, but the difference can be remarkable. Even after following all these steps, there is still one final habit that brings everything together, and without it, many gardeners never enjoy the full reward of all the work they have already done. The final step may sound almost too simple after everything we have talked about, but over the years I have learned that it is often the difference between a gardener who enjoys every season and one who feels disappointed year after year. I stopped chasing perfect tomatoes and started paying attention to my plants almost every day, even if I had only 10 minutes to spare. I walk slowly through the garden and look at each plant without rushing. I notice the color of the leaves, the condition of the stems, the flowers that have just opened, and the fruits that are beginning to ripen. Small changes are much easier to correct than big problems. Many people only visit their tomatoes when they have enough time for serious work, but by then they often discover that something has already gone wrong. A few quiet minutes each day have saved more of my harvest than any expensive product I have ever bought. Another habit I never skip is removing ripe tomatoes as soon as they are ready. I do not leave them hanging because they look beautiful on the plant. Every tomato that is picked tells the plant to continue working and producing more fruit. This simple routine keeps the harvest going much longer than many people expect. I also save seeds only from my healthiest and most productive plants whenever I grow open-pollinated varieties, because over the years this has helped me maintain strong, reliable tomatoes without spending extra money. It is another old method that many gardeners have forgotten, but it still works just as well today. When I look back at all these seasons, I realize that large, healthy tomatoes are not the result of one miracle trick. They come from many small decisions that seem almost unimportant when taken one at a time. Planting at the right moment, preparing the soil, carefully watering wisely, protecting moisture, giving the plant proper support, feeding with balance, helping the flowers develop, and watching the plants regularly all work together. That is why I still enjoy growing tomatoes every year, even after so many seasons. I hope these simple steps help you avoid the mistakes that slowed me down for years and give you an earlier harvest with bigger, healthier tomatoes. And once you see how much difference these habits can make, you may find yourself looking forward to the next growing season even more than the current one, because every year brings another chance to do just a little better.